These are weird times, so we thought we'd maybe start the webinar in a weird way. Going to open up a video here. Thought we could lighten things up a bit. This always cracks me up, and I thought it'd be pretty relevant for the situation that I'm sure many of us are in today.
Scandals happen all the time. The question is, how do democracies respond to those scandals?
And what will it mean for the wider region? I think one of your children has just walked in. I mean, shifting sands in the region. Do you think relations with the North may change?
I would be surprised if they do. Pardon me.
That's right, carry on.
My apologies.
What's this going to mean for the region?
My apologies. South Korea's policy choices on North Korea have been severely limited in the last.
So with that, if you hear any background noise, sirens, crying, apologies in advance. Gonna advance it. Uh-oh. And it looks like with everyone streaming Netflix and on Zoom, internet connections are a bit slow. So apologies for the pixelated view here. As Maggie mentioned, we'll be sending these slides out afterwards. So if anything's coming through pixelated, you will get the hard copy. But right out of the gate, we just want to address what that blind spot is, right? The blind spot, we think, is customer concentration, right? We've been at this, as Maggie mentioned, for quite a few years. We work with several dozen private equity firms, and customer concentration is almost always a leading risk factor in transactions. And we know it's one of the leading causes of deal failure. But what we've realized over the years in doing this work is that it's not actually customer concentration. It's a bit more than that. It's a bit more complex. The blind spot is really revenue concentration. When we look just at customer concentration, we're forgetting that there's an interplay between revenue generated by customers and revenue generated by our products and our services. And that's what we want to talk about today. We want to talk about how we define revenue concentration risk. We want to talk about how we help clients identify that risk in the deals that they're evaluating or in their own portfolio companies. And finally, discuss some tools we have to mitigate this risk, both during the diligence window, but also post-close. So how do we define revenue concentration risk? Well, we rely on a time-tested tool, and that's the 80-20 rule, also known as the Pareto principle. Originally developed and used by economists to study income inequality, but adopted by Illinois Toolworks in the 1980s as a way to think about the way to maximize the profitability of businesses. 80-20 rule is just one of those weird things that we see in all facets of our personal and business lives. And so it's one of those rules of nature that just happen over and over again. Sometimes we're aware of it, sometimes we're not. I bet if we were all look at our closets, we would find that we wear 20% of our clothes 80% of the time, right? When we look at our businesses, 20% of our employees are probably doing 80% of the work. 20% of our employees are probably causing 80% of your headaches as well. We see this is true with customers in B2B organizations. About 20% of the customer base generates 80% of revenue. And it's also true with products, services, projects, SKUs, whatever the unit is for your business. About 20% of those generate 80% of your revenue. And that's how we define revenue concentration risk. It's not just looking at customers, it's looking at the bigger picture. Because we review, dozens of SIMs and management presentations every year. And yeah, maybe there's one or two slides that talk about concentration. Maybe we see the top 10 customers and the percent of revenue. But a lot of companies don't think they have concentration risk when they really do. Classic example is, we're actually working with one right now. Software as a service businesses, right? They say, I don't have customer concentration. No single account is more than 1% of my revenue. We say that's true, but let's look at what that one account is purchasing, right? Are they purchasing different modules? Are they purchasing additional licenses? Are they doing custom development? Are they paying us more to do software integrations, right? Just the face value of the customer alone doesn't tell us the whole picture. So the way we think about this and the way we define it, open up a different window here really quickly, is through what we call a quartile analysis. And for simplicity here, let's just assume we're talking about a target company with 100 customers. What we do is we look at the customer base and we rank order those 100 customers by revenue. So customer number 1 by revenue, customer number 100 by revenue. And we put those customers into 4 evenly spaced quartiles. So the top 25 customers by revenue, the top 50, the top 75, and of course, the top 100. The first number we plug in is the percent of revenue that each of these quartiles generate for the target, right? We do this a couple hundred times a year, and the numbers we're gonna put in these boxes don't deviate all that much. You know, I wouldn't be surprised if 90% of what we observe falls within a curve of maybe plus or minus 5 points from the numbers we're going to see here. We're actually so confident in these numbers, they're actually printed on the back of our business cards. But the percent of revenue generated by quartile 1, 25% of the customer base, is about 89%. The second quartile is 7. The third is usually 1. And the bottom quartile is 1%. So what this tells us, you know, it's confirmatory of the 80-20 rule, not surprisingly, but what it tells us is that the bottom half of our customer base, 50% of our customers, are generating typically less than 5% of revenue. And then we have the top quartile, our most valuable customers, generating 90%, sometimes even higher. Now this is interesting, but frankly, it's a bit tactical, it's a bit trivial. So to really understand how we make the strategic and act on it and then elevate the chance of successful deals is to fill in the next 2 columns. And those columns are cost and profit. Now cost, you know, this could be overhead, this could be effort, this could be SG&A, you know, depending on the business, what goes in this column, how we define what goes in this column varies. But what often ends up happening is that the cost it takes to service these accounts is not proportionate to revenue generated by these accounts. Because when customer number 1 calls, we do the exact same thing, or most businesses do the exact same thing as when customer 100 calls. The phone rings, we pick it up, we place the order, we service the account, we manufacture, we ship, we do whatever it takes to fulfill that order, fulfill that request, the same way, no matter if you're the most valuable customer or the least valuable customer. So since in business, we forget 80-20 sometimes, and we treat everyone the same, what ends up happening is our costs are allocated pretty evenly across quartiles. What this means from a profit implication, and this is where, you know, when we do this in person, eyes light up, is that about 150%, if not more, of a target company's profit is actually generated by the top quartile of the customer base. In some instances, I think we've even seen this closer to 200, 250%. And I'm sure you're asking, how is that possible? Well, it's possible because if you look down here, you've got 1% of your revenue, and it's 25% of your SG&A, overhead, effort, whatever it may be. We're losing a ton of money. 25% of our cost to get 1% of our revenue. We're losing a lot of money here as well. And we're probably even losing here. Some of the really strong companies we work with, maybe they break even if they're lucky. So we run through this analysis, we understand where we're actually making our money. And when we look at it this way, we actually find concentration is much more prevalent than we expect, especially with businesses that historically don't think they have concentration. Because going back to our software example, you know, that company, no single customer had more than 2% of revenue, but they had 2,500 customers. And there were still 50 that were about 1 to 1.5% of revenue. So they still had an extremely long tail, and there still was a lot of concentration when you look at it from a quartile perspective, not just a percent of revenue on an individual basis. But we like to take it a step further, because what we typically observe is that this applies not only to customers, it also applies to products, to services, as I mentioned, to whatever the unit may be. So we have customer concentration, we have product concentration, we have really profitable customers, we have really unprofitable products, and vice versa. Now, if we look at the bottom half of our customer base, right? Oops, let me undo that, it's too thick. If we look at the bottom half of our customer base, we may write these customers off, right? They're 4%, they're 50% of my costs. I don't need them, I'm gonna let them go, I'm gonna raise prices. And we say that's not quite the right thing to do, because we have to look at the other side of the coin. We have to look at the product side. Some of these customers may be buying products and services up here. And some of these products and services that aren't very profitable may be going to our top accounts. So when I say the interplay between customers and products, this is really what we're talking about. It's not looking at one dimension, it's looking at both dimensions to truly understand what the concentration picture looks like. So once we do this analysis, we're able to put customers into quadrants. We have A customers buying A products, our 80%ers buying our 80%. That's about 64% of a typical target company, and probably true for many of your portfolios as well. We call this the fort. If you lose one customer here, or if one customer even lowers their share of wallet, there could be a very material impact on the valuation of the business, on the investment thesis, and on the ability to generate an ROIC that is acceptable to limited partners, other stakeholders. We have to do everything we possibly can to make sure this fort, right, is secure. And that's where customer diligence comes in. These other quadrants each get their own strategies, their own tactics. We help companies navigate that post-close, but in the diligence window, what we're really focusing on is how to make sure this is secure and there's still opportunity for this to grow. Because remember, oftentimes we're paying for this, but this is really where all the value creation potential lies. So that's how we define revenue concentration. I'm gonna go back to our slides here.
Anthony, I'm going to stop you right there. I have a question here from Mark, and he asks, what data do you need to run this type of analysis?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. To do the quartile, to just look at revenue by customer and understand where the concentration lies in the top quartile, it's pretty simple, actually. All we need is revenue by customer, either for the past year, past 3 years. Sometimes we like to roll it up if there's more fluctuation. But for the quartiles, all we need is revenue by customer. For a product quartile, all we need is revenue by product. Now, if we want to actually do that quadrant and look at the interplay between customer and product, that's where the data request is a bit more intense. We need transactional level data, so a list of every customer and what specifically they bought. So customer A purchased product XYZ in these quantities at these price. So more of a transactional database, if you will, to do the quadrants. Great. All right, so now that we've defined it, let's talk about how to identify if this risk is prevalent in a deal you're considering or with one of your portfolios. Because the ultimate question really is your fort secure, right? We've established how critical the fort is, both from the implications for a transaction, but also for the success of a portfolio. How can we answer that question? How do we know if the fort is secure? And Net Promoter Score is one tool out there that a lot of companies are using, and for good reason, right? Net Promoter Score is time tested. It's been around for almost 10 years now. In the B2B world, Net Promoter Score is still predictive of a company's future growth outlook. In the consumer world, not as predictive, but in B2B, if you are a company with a category leading net promoter score, odds are your customers are loyal, they're secure, and your company is well positioned to outpace the category growth rate. Now, it's one number. One number alone cannot tell the whole story. So we look at a lot of other metrics as well. Because we have to remember that net promoter score, let this catch up for a second.
You know, while that catches up, I have a question here from Steve. I actually have two questions. My first question is, I've measured NPS before, but the lack of benchmarks made it difficult to draw any conclusions from it. How do you determine what a good score is?
Yeah, that's a great question. And frankly, in B2B, there aren't very reliable benchmarks. In consumer space, there's some syndicated resources that are regularly publishing benchmarks, but in B2B, especially given how niche B2B can get, there really isn't a go-to source for a benchmark. That being said, we know there's ranges that qualify as good, as great, as best in class. But frankly, what we say is I don't necessarily care so much what your net promoter score is when we do an initial assessment. I care more that it's trending in the right direction. So over time, is the score improving, and are we seeing it reflected in top line results? Because a net promoter score increase should correlate pretty nicely with top line results, right? And that's why net promoter score, as the slide looks like it caught up here, that's exactly the point, right? Net promoter score is a diagnosis. It's not a prescription. It doesn't tell you what to do. It just tells you if you're sick or not.
And before you keep going, we have one more question that comes from another Steve. And it goes back to some of your 80-20 data. Steve was wondering, why did you apply 25% of costs to the bottom two quadrants of your customers?
So Steve, if I'm understanding the question correctly, the question is, why do we have 25% of our costs allocated here and here? And the answer goes back to the fact that we are so conditioned to treat all customers equally, right? Customer experience is such a hot topic right now, and for good reason, right? We want customers to be treated well. No, we want customers to be treated well, but it's okay to treat certain customers differently, right? It is okay to treat these top accounts differently at the deliberate expense of these bottom accounts. But in business, we're so egalitarian, right? We like to treat everyone the same because we want to do a good job for everyone. Oftentimes, these customers aren't just, customer number 1, customer number 15, customer number 80. They're Joe and Jill and Jack, and you have personal relationships. You know them. You want to do right by them. They're long-standing, emotional connections you have with these people. So even though you might be customer number 99 and you brought in 10K last year, while customer number 100 brought in 10 million, we still go out of our way to treat customer 99 the same way we treat customer number 1. Our CEO, David, has this great anecdote that he uses when he presents to a group. He goes up there and he randomly calls on someone. He says, what do you do? Think about the most important person in your life, whether that be a spouse, a child, a sibling. And he says, what do you do for that person on their birthday? And, the person he calls on typically says, I get them flowers, I send them a card, I buy them a gift, I call them, I go visit them, I take them out to dinner. And then he says, that's great. What do you do for me on my birthday? And the person says, I don't even know when your birthday is. I don't do anything. That's the whole point, right? In our personal lives, we're really good at doing 80-20, but when we get to work, we try and treat everyone the same. And it's well-intentioned. It's just it's really tough to maximize profitability when everyone gets the same level of time and effort. So Steve, hopefully that answers the question. If not, we can talk more afterward. So going back to Net Promoter Score, it's a good tool. It's a great metric to track, but it doesn't tell the whole story. And most importantly, it doesn't tell us what we actually have to do. So here's some other things we like to ask to understand if a target's fort is secure. Yes, Net Promoter Score. We also like to ask customers if the target is perceived as being just a transactional vendor, or are they perceived, sort of a higher order strategic partner? This is usually a really interesting way to understand the stickiness of the relationship, right? If customers perceive the target just to be a commodity, there's plenty of other substitutes. My relationship is purely transactional. I could do with or without them. Not a whole lot of stickiness there. Versus if we hear customers tell us that they're thought leaders, there's really high engagement, they co-develop new product services, they're really strategic. If I didn't have this company, my business wouldn't be as successful as it is. That shows us that there's more of a relationship there. These accounts are more sticky. We also look at share of wallet, right? If we have a relatively low share of wallet, we know the competitive set is crowded. They're working with a lot of other suppliers. Versus a relatively high share of wallet, it tells us that we're being able to fulfill all of their needs. We're engaging. Our customer experience is working for them. But the other reason we like to ask this is because it helps quantify what the runway is, right? If we've got 100% share of wallet with all of the accounts in the fort, it might be hard to organically increase revenue there. So we like to understand if there's any runway to capture even greater share. And this is a great way to measure that. How the target ranks relative to other suppliers is always a very insightful question. Sometimes even more so than Net Promoter Score. We understand how the company ranks relative to other suppliers. Are they first? Are they second? Are they third? Why do they prefer working with us? Why do they prefer working with competitors? What can we do to start capturing some more share of wallet? So while we do call this diligence, hopefully what you're starting to catch on to is that, yes, this helps check the diligence box. We're certainly assessing the state of these relationships, but it can also be a really powerful value creation tool because along the way, we're capturing a lot of really, really rich feedback and insights on what we can do to grow these customers. And then finally, we like to look at future spend, right? Do customers anticipate their spend with us going forward will increase, decrease, stay the same? And the key question behind all of these is why, right? This is why we very, very rarely do this via web survey, because web surveys can get me the numbers, but they don't put those numbers in context. It's only through interviews, right? Actual in-person interviews where we can ask the question why, get that context, probe a little bit deeper, understand the drivers and barriers behind all of these questions, and really convert those insights into action.
Okay, before you move on, I have a great question from Brian. Some of these are sensitive topics. How do you get accurate feedback?
So Brian, if I'm understanding, how do we get accurate feedback from the customers that we interview? Couple best practices we have. First is when we call a customer to interview them, we say we're calling on behalf of the target company, right? We never say we're calling on behalf of an acquirer. We say this is an initiative that the target company is sponsored Strategex to conduct in order to understand what they can do to better serve you. So from the perspective of the customer, this is business as usual, right? We're not tipping them off to a potential transaction. We're not disclosing any other parties. So that's one way we do it. The second way is just by virtue of being a third party, we often uncover feedback that customers are sometimes even hesitant to tell their account managers themselves, right? And it goes back to what I was saying earlier, right? The relationships that we have with these customers is often emotional. right? The account managers know these customers. They've worked with them in some cases for decades. They go to their kids' birthday parties. They know their birthday. They do something special for their birthday. And sometimes you're just not comfortable saying and being frank with someone that you have a relationship with, right? The metaphor we always use is that you would never tell your best friend that their baby is ugly, but you might tell a total stranger that the baby's ugly. And we're that total stranger, right? As a third party and having a degree of anonymity, customers open up, they tell us how they really feel, and they're much more candid in these interviews than they would be in certain instances with target companies themselves. And also by being a third party, the final point, we're able to, especially in a competitive context, we're able to collect information that customers just might not feel comfortable sharing with target companies. Who else they're working with, what their share of wallet is, what the competition's doing better. We're able to get competitive insights with much more success than companies that try and do this type of work directly. And also pricing feedback, right? A customer will never go to an account manager and say, your prices are lower than the competition. I'm getting more value than you're charging me for. But not uncommon for us to hear that type of feedback. All right, so we've identified, and now finally, how do we mitigate revenue concentration risk? Again, this touches on what I said earlier, where yes, we call this diligence, but a lot of the value kicks in post-close because we can use this to inform value creation playbooks. We can use this to inform strategic planning, and we can use it on a very tactical level as well. We can actually use this to develop account level engagement plans post-close. So some additional questions that we ask to inform all of those inputs. Understanding what the target's doing really well, right? Going into a company, knowing what the strengths are, knowing what the differentiators are, really understanding what the foundation of the value proposition is always really important to know so that we don't go in and start screwing up what's already working. But conversely, we always like to understand where the areas for improvement might be. What are those most pressing 2 or 3 things that if we worked to alleviate them would really, not only improve our net promoter score, but improve our share of wallet, drive more high value referrals, make more sticky relationships. And oftentimes, what we hear when we ask this type of question, it's often not a fundamental re-engineering of how we're doing business. Quite often what we hear at this question are just little, speed bumps in the way that we're doing business, whether it be the invoicing process or the format of invoicing, or whether it be, they use Skype and I really like Zoom, right? It's stuff like that, little changes that we can put in place that make a big difference with these top accounts. We look at the customer experience. So what we like to do is identify maybe half dozen up to 10 of the major touch points in your customer experience. So quality and lead times and delivery and communication, those fundamentals of how we're doing business. We like to get satisfaction ratings on each of those individually so that we get a really, granular understanding of how satisfied customers are. And then if there's any areas where we're seeing some softness, again, the benefit of having these as live conversations is we can pause and say, tell me why you're not satisfied with lead times. What are your expectations? What are competitor lead times? What suggestions do you have for making them better? So it becomes a very diagnostic exercise, but unlike Net Promoter Score, it's also extremely prescriptive because customers tell us exactly what it is we can do to get better. And oftentimes in the first 100 days, we can implement some of these changes and really solidify any accounts that might be at risk, locking down the fort, while also laying the foundation for growing these accounts as well through capturing a greater share of wallet. And the way we ask this is always really interesting. It's one of my favorite questions that we ask is, in the last 12 months, was there a situation where you could have awarded business to the target, but you chose not to, and you gave it to a competitor instead? Right? It's a great question because we were qualified to win the business, but it didn't come to us, which means the reason we lost was something in our control. And it's amazing how rarely we actually hear price. Oftentimes, it's some of those fundamentals of the customer experience. Oftentimes, it's those little speed bumps that we can remove to make it easier to do business. It's always a really, really insightful question. When you actually put the numbers behind it and do the math, it's amazing how much we're leaving on the table and how quickly we can capture share of wallet just by doing some pretty simple things. One of the phrases that our 80/20 experts like to use is that great businesses don't do extraordinary things. They just do simple things extraordinarily well. And through this process, we get a really, really clear understanding of what those simple things are that customers are expecting us to improve. And then finally, a bit longer term, looking at unmet needs or underserved needs, looking at any gaps in our product or service portfolio, understanding what we can do either from a development perspective or from an add-on perspective to round out the offering, become more of a one-stop shop, become more of that strategic partner, and further drive top line. But if there's one thing I want everyone to take away from this, it's that asking questions isn't enough, right? If an insight is useless if we don't act on it. The best way to secure the fort is to create raving fans, right? There's a fantastic book, recommend everyone read it, called Raving Fans. And the premise of the book is that customers are so conditioned to mediocrity, right? Customers are so conditioned to vendors under-promising and over-delivering. It's not hard to get a pretty decent Net Promoter Score. It's really hard to get a Net Promoter Score of 100. And we would argue that if your fort's Net Promoter Score is not 100, they're at risk. Is again, if you lose one of them, if one of them lowers spend, there will be a material impact on EBITDA. So the end goal for doing customer diligence is to, yes, feel more secure about the transaction, know that in the short term, the customer base is secure. But in the longer term, the purpose of Voice of Customer is to really transition it more into a management tool to create these raving fans and to keep our pulse on the fort to make sure it's growing and it's not being compromised. So some things that we help clients do, the guiding principle is to reinforce what I said earlier, is to help companies understand and show them how they can treat customers in that fort differently. They deserve to be treated differently, and it's a profitable business necessitates that they be treated differently. And the classic example here is airlines. Airlines have figured this out. I fly United out of Chicago, but if I were ever to take a Delta flight, I would be last to board. They would charge me to check a bag. I would be last row, middle seats. The drink cart probably wouldn't even get to me by the time we landed. But I arrive at the same time in the same condition as someone who maybe got upgraded, got a free bag, were greeted by name when they boarded. Airlines treat customers differently. They have customer loyalty programs in place because they know certain flyers are worth a whole lot more than someone that maybe flies once every other year. That's just one example of how this can be implemented. So things that we often discuss with clients is helping them implement things like key account management, thinking about the customer experience, not just as a blanket experience, but very tailored based on whether or not you're a top account or not. Thinking about the workflow, going back to customer number 1 placing an order, customer 100 placing an order. If customer 100 just happens to call 5 minutes earlier than customer number 1, in many businesses, that order by customer 100 takes priority over the order placed by customer 1 because it's first in, first out. So we start thinking about ways to re-engineer our workflows, re-engineer our experiences to make sure we're treating those top accounts differently. We also work to develop engagement plans, make sure that customers in the fort have proactive engagement, quarterly, monthly, weekly meetings, whatever's appropriate, that they have access to the senior management team. These are the customers that warrant new product development, co-investments, thinking about thought leadership, co-presenting at conferences, making it a mutually beneficial relationship so that it's sticky on both ends. And this idea that I just really like this idea, and it's hard for some people to accept. Again, going back to the notion that we all want to exceed expectations at all times. Raving Fan says the reason customers are satisfied is because so many businesses are just doing the basics. It's helping target companies understand that if they really, really want to have a raving fan, maybe we can start over-promising, setting the bar really high, really, really aspirational, and getting maybe really, really close, maybe 80% of the way, better than getting 100% of the way for a mediocre goal. So really quickly, just want to take you through a case study, show you how all of this comes together in a real world example. So what we're looking at here, private equity client came to us. They had a target company they were evaluating. Their top customer was 48% of their revenue. And the top 3 customers were 80% of revenue. And this was an instance where I think the total customer base was about 80 accounts. So an instance of extreme concentration, absolutely critical to make sure those top accounts were stable and were secure. We ended up conducting 14 interviews across 7 accounts, which means we conducted more than 1 interview at certain accounts, which is always the best practice, especially in instances where there's extreme concentration. We want to get multiple perspectives. It's not a representative assessment of an account if we just go in and talk to one person. Because if we went into an account and talked to someone in procurement, they may have a very, very different perception than someone who's actually on the floor working with the parts that this company made, right? Procurement's going to look at it from a very rational cost-benefit perspective. The person on the floor might say, yeah, but the quality is fantastic. I don't have to spend nearly as much time troubleshooting and going through problem resolution. So we like to kind of balance the feedback from different stakeholders. The fact that we do this as conversations is not as web surveys really, really helps our response rate. So in this instance, we had a response rate of over 80%. The very rare instance we do this via web survey, the response rate is maybe 8% if we're lucky. So again, a huge benefit of doing this live is you get much more people to participate, which is critical when you only need to talk to a few people. Because if we didn't do this via conversation and we did it via web survey, it would have meant that in order to get feedback, we have had to interview everyone, even potentially account 80, which is worthless. We really, really have to talk to those top accounts. The only way to do that is through actual conversations. So we spoke with those 14 customers, and a lot of people stop us there and they say, wait a minute, this is 14 people. It's such a small sample size. You can't be confident in your results. You can't make conclusions. And we say, yes, we absolutely can, because those 14 people represent 94% of your revenue, right? These are the people that are driving your business. These are the people that are going to sustain the business going forward. It absolutely is representative. Because the truth is, so many companies already have their eggs in one basket, they just don't know it. And this brings that to life. And when people realize just how few relationships matter, it's often eye-opening because they realize how much time they've been wasting on relationships that don't matter. And in many, many instances, actually cost us profit. So here's an instance, and I will say this is not a typical set of results. These diligence engagements are more often than not confirmatory, as all diligence should be. But the reason I share this example is because it can demonstrate just how risky it can be to move forward with the transaction if you don't understand the stability of the customer base. So in this instance, their net promoter score was about 30, which, good, not great. absolutely room for improvement. But what was really concerning is that we identified that account number 3, which was 15% of revenue, and account number 5, which is 3% of revenue, were at risk. Both of those accounts said they were either planning to lower their spend or completely walk away in the next year. Account number 2, which is 17% of revenue, while they didn't explicitly say they're leaving, they raised systemic issues with enough severity for us to still say that something has to be done immediately post-close, otherwise this account will be at risk. So right here, we're looking at about 40% of the revenue base potentially being at risk post-close. And this was all news, right? That the target didn't know this, the acquirer, potential acquirer didn't know this. And if they did not have this information, the outcome would not have been what it was. And then to make matters worse, we only heard one customer say that their spend with the company going forward will increase. Everyone else said spend will either decline or stay the same. Lead times, delivery performance, quality, all received not optimal scores. Again, especially considering we spoke with top accounts. If account number 1 isn't getting a quality part when they need it, no wonder the business is at risk, right? So we're able to not just say business is at risk, we're able to really get granular and diagnose specifically why an account may or may not stick around. And then from a competitive perspective, we found that it was very, very crowded. Customers were working with a dozen or more suppliers in many instances. And when we asked these customers to rank the target relative to the other suppliers, only 16% said we're better than the competition, right? So a huge majority of customers prefer working with other suppliers, and just a matter of time until they capture even more share of wallet. So, a pretty dire picture. Again, not a typical set of results that we report, but I think it's a nice summary of just how important this is, because this is a case where there absolutely is a high degree of risk. The ability to generate value post-close is jeopardized, and to actually turn this company around was going to require more than this particular client wanted to put into it. There's absolutely going to be a check after the check. They were going to have to be much more hands-on than they were expecting. They were probably going to have to bring in an operating partner, which was not part of the playbook. So in this instance, the PE firm actually walked away from the deal. And what they told us afterwards is, you saved me about $40 million and a lot of headaches, right? So I think it's just a nice way to summarize that this is, yes, again, diligence. It impacts valuation. It impacts whether or not we go forward with transactions. But it is also a great management tool. It's a great way to understand what those headaches will be coming up and what the prescription is to help them go away down the road. So go back to my other slide here. And I think we're right on time. Maggie, any other questions that came through?
Yes, I do have a couple questions, and thank you to everyone who has been putting them into the chat portal. Feel free to add more, and we'll get to as many as we can. First question, how long does it take to complete a typical engagement?
Oh, yeah. So for the diligence projects, that's typically 3 to 4 weeks. There's usually 1 week to get everything set up, 1 to 1.5 weeks to actually conduct the interviews, and then a couple days to put together a report. Now, that doesn't mean you need to wait until the end to get the results and understand implications and risk factors, because what we're doing, as the interviews are conducted, we're actually funneling transcripts throughout the process. So after each interview, we prepare a complete transcript of the conversation. We get that in your hands right away. We start developing the themes and the story about, on average, 5 to 7 days into the process. So pretty turnkey, pretty quick process. Post-close, when we work with portfolio companies to implement the 80-20 strategies, those are more ongoing engagements. We go month to month, and oftentimes with portfolio companies that can be a year and a half, 2 years. But with our corporate accounts, I think we've got one that's on year 7. We just know with portfolio companies, the timeline's a bit more limited given the desire to exit.
Okay, here's another question. With which types of deals do you find customer diligence adds the most value?
Yeah, so B2B transactions where there's customer concentration, right, doesn't work as well with consumer businesses. Certain consumer businesses, there may be some value here, but where you're going to get the most out of this is if it's B2B and if there's customer product revenue concentration as we just defined it, which frankly is almost every B2B company, right? There may be a couple exceptions here or there, but when you start thinking about revenue concentration, not just customer concentration, 80% plus probably qualify.
Great. Here's another question. By interviewing customers, aren't you disclosing a potential transaction and possibly violating the terms of the LOI?
Yes, and that's the first question that sellers and advisors, investment banks always ask us. I touched on it a little bit earlier, but the mechanism we have in place to prevent that is we never say we're calling on behalf of an acquirer. We never disclose a pending transaction. We never disclose other parties. The way this process works is before we contact any customers, the seller first announces to those customers that Strategex will be contacting them to participate in an interview, right? They send out an announcement letter, something along the lines of, hey, valued customer, we really want to understand what we can do to better serve you. In order to do that, we've hired Strategex to conduct a satisfaction survey. Would really appreciate it if you took time out of your day to participate. So the seller sends that out. There's 2 critical reasons. Is A, it gets us that really, really high response rate, right? Without that, we would have a single-digit response rate because we would essentially be cold calling. But with that warm-up, we get about a 70 to 80% response rate. And then the other reason it's so critical is it positions it as satisfaction, which means we don't disclose the transaction and we don't violate the confidentiality clause of the LOI. Looks like the first account had 50% of the interviews. Is that not concentration? That's from Paul. So what I believe Paul is referring to, if I go back to the case study really quickly, is this slide where account number 1 had 50% of the interviews. So 6 of our 14 interviews were with account number 1. And the reason we did that is because account number 1 is half of revenue, right? So we really wanted to go a few people deep with account number 1, knowing how critical that relationship is. We didn't want to risk just interviewing one person at account 1 who was maybe having a bad day or who maybe, their last experience with us wasn't the best. Given how large and important that account is, we had to get multiple perspectives in order to be comfortable making an assessment about the state of that relationship. A couple other questions that probably require more time than what we have left. So I will follow up with you individually. Could you share a typical list of items you request from customers to finalize your analysis? Yeah, great question. So George, what we ask for, once you have exclusivity, what we look at are past 3-year financial statements. We look at the SIM, we look at the management presentation, whatever documents are available. And then we ask for revenue by customer. And if you have it, revenue by product. We know sometimes you can be tricky getting hands on that until post-close, but at a minimum, what we like to look at is revenue by customer, just to help us identify which specific accounts we want to interview. So it's the financial statements, it's the SIM, and its revenue by customer. And then post-close, if we want to do some additional analyses, the quadrants that I mentioned, another analysis called key ratio that we look at, there's some additional requests for that. All right, and I think we got 5 minutes left. The rest of the questions are a bit more nuanced, so I'll follow up with you individually. I want to give you some time back. I'm sure you've all got other things to move on to. But thanks again for joining us today. Let me put my info up here again. Feel free to reach out anytime if you got questions. And Maggie will be in touch, if not tomorrow, then early next week with a recording and slides.
Thank you.